The morning mist hung low over the river as Jack cast his line into the dark water. He had been fishing this same spot for over 40 years, ever since his father first brought him here as a boy. The gentle sound of the current and the occasional splash of fish jumping nearby had always brought him peace. Today was no different from any other Thursday. Jack had woken before dawn, made his thermos of coffee, grabbed his tackle box, and driven his old pickup truck down to his favorite fishing spot just outside of town. The wooden dock creaked under his weight as he settled onto his fold-out chair, the same one he'd been using for the past 15 years. "Just you and me again, old river," Jack said to himself, watching his breath form small clouds in the cool morning air. Fall was settling in, bringing with it shorter days and a chill that seeped into his bones more with each passing year. 3 hours into his morning routine, Jack had caught 2 decent-sized trout. He had cleaned them and placed them in his cooler, thinking about the fish fry he would have later. His wife Linda made the best cornmeal batter, and their grandkids were coming over for dinner. It would be a good day. He was about to pack up, when something caught his eye downstream. At first he thought it was just a large branch or maybe part of an old tree trunk caught in the reeds about 50 yards away. But there was something unusual about its shape. Too straight, too rectangular, to be natural. "What in the world?" Jack mumbled, setting down his fishing rod. Curiosity got the better of him as he packed up his gear and walked along the muddy riverbank toward the strange object. As he got closer, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. The object was long and box-shaped, made of wood that had clearly been in the water for some time. Algae and river weeds clung to its sides, but there was no mistaking what it was. A coffin. Jack stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. In all his years fishing this river, he had seen all sorts of things wash up. Tires, old refrigerators, even a mannequin once that had given him quite a scare. But never anything like this. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, thinking he should call someone, the police maybe. But as he looked at the screen, he saw he had no signal out here, not unusual for this remote spot. The coffin wasn't very large, too small for an adult. This thought made Jack's stomach turn. He stood frozen, unsure what to do, watching as the current gently pushed the coffin against the reeds, threatening to pull it back into the river's flow. "I can't just leave it," he said aloud, as if trying to convince himself. If it floated away, who knows where it might end up or how long it would take for someone else to find it. With a deep breath, he set down his tackle box and cooler on dry land and waded into the shallow water. The mud sucked at his boots as he carefully made his way toward the coffin. The water was cold, seeping into his clothes, but Jack barely noticed. His mind was racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. As he reached the coffin, he saw it was in worse shape than he'd initially thought. The wood was waterlogged and beginning to split in places. It wasn't a professionally made coffin like you'd see at a funeral home, but something rougher, handmade. There were no markings or nameplate, just simple wooden planks nailed together. Jack reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the side of the coffin. It was heavier than he expected, and for a moment he feared he wouldn't be able to move it. Gritting his teeth, he pulled with all his strength. Slowly, the coffin began to move, breaking free from the mud and reeds that had trapped it. "Come on," Jack grunted, pulling it toward the shore. His back screamed in protest. He wasn't as young as he used to be, but he didn't stop. Inch by inch, he dragged the coffin until it was fully on the riverbank. Water dripped from the wood as Jack caught his breath, his clothes soaked and muddy. Now that the coffin was out of the water, he could see it was about 4 feet long. The nails holding it together were rusted, and in some places, the wood had begun to rot. Jack looked up and down the empty riverbank. Not a soul in sight, just as he liked it when he went fishing. But now the solitude felt eerie rather than peaceful. He knew he should wait for authorities. This could be evidence of something terrible. But what if there was someone inside who needed help? What if it had been some kind of accident? "That's ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "No one's alive in there after being in the river." Still, the thought nagged at him. Jack walked back to his truck, parked about a quarter mile away, to see if he could get cell service there. As he suspected, there was still no signal. The nearest town was a 20-minute drive, and the idea of leaving the coffin unattended for that long didn't sit right with him. He returned to the riverbank where the coffin waited like a grim mystery. The sun had risen higher now, burning away some of the morning mist. Birds sang in the trees nearby, oblivious to Jack's dark discovery. For nearly an hour, Jack sat on a fallen log, keeping watch over the coffin while debating what to do. He thought about his grandkids coming over that evening, about Linda waiting for him at home, probably wondering why he was taking so long. As time passed, his unease grew. What if it started raining and the river rose, carrying the coffin away before he could return with help? What if there was something inside that needed immediate attention? Finally, Jack made his decision. He would open it just enough to see what was inside. If it was what he feared, he would close it immediately and go for help. He approached the coffin again, kneeling beside it on the damp ground. The lid was sealed shut, either by design or from the wood swelling in the water. Jack took out his pocket knife, the same one his father had given him on his 16th birthday, and worked it into the seam between the lid and the side. "Please don't let it be what I'm thinking," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. He hadn't been to church in years. It took several minutes of careful prying before he felt the lid loosen. Setting his knife aside, Jack took a deep breath and placed his hands on either side of the lid. With a silent count to 3, he lifted. The hinges, if there had ever been any, were long gone. The lid came away more easily than he expected, nearly causing him to fall backward. He set it aside carefully, then steeled himself to look inside. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There was no body, no human remains of any kind. Instead, the coffin was filled with what looked like personal belongings. Photos in wooden frames, their glass cloudy with river water, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, a small teddy bear now soaked and dirty, and various other small items he couldn't immediately identify. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed quickly by confusion. Why would someone put these things in a coffin and send it down the river? It didn't make sense. Carefully, he picked up one of the photo frames and wiped away the grime with his thumb. The image showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 young children, standing in front of a small house. They were smiling, dressed in clothes that looked to be from 20 or 30 years ago. As Jack studied the photo, a strange feeling came over him. There was something familiar about the man's face, something that tugged at his memory. He picked up another frame, this one containing a photo of a young man in an army uniform. The face was clearer in this picture, and Jack's hands began to shake. "No, it can't be," he whispered. The young soldier in the photo was Tom Wilson, Jack's childhood friend. They had grown up together, enlisted together, and served side by side until that terrible day in Vietnam when their unit was ambushed. Jack had made it out with a bullet in his leg. Tom hadn't made it out at all. Jack's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He picked up another photo, then another, each one revealing more memories of a friend he had tried so hard to forget because remembering hurt too much. There was Tom on his wedding day with Beth, the sweetheart he'd written to every day while they were overseas. There were their children, whom Jack had watched grow up from a distance because being around Tom's family was too painful a reminder of what had happened. As Jack looked through the items in the coffin, the story began to piece itself together. This wasn't some macabre joke or criminal evidence. This was a family's treasures, their memories, their history. And somehow, it had ended up in the river. Tears streamed down Jack's weathered face as he held Tom's army medal in his hand. He hadn't cried since the day they told him Tom wasn't coming home. But now, sitting alone by the river with his friend's life literally laid out before him, the dam broke. "Oh, Tom," he said through his tears. "What happened to your family? How did all this end up here?" As Jack sat there surrounded by the remnants of his friend's life, he knew he had to find out. He had to know what had happened to Beth and the kids and why their precious memories had been set adrift in this makeshift coffin. With gentle hands, he began to carefully examine each item, searching for clues about where the Wilson family might be now. and why their treasures had found their way back to him after all these years. Jack spent the next hour carefully going through the items in the wooden box, laying them out on his jacket to dry in the late morning sun. His fishing trip long forgotten, he handled each object with a reverence usually reserved for holy things. Among the photos and papers, Jack found Tom's wedding ring, a simple gold band that Beth had saved up for months to buy. He remembered being there when she picked it out, asking his opinion as if he knew anything about jewelry. He had just nodded and said it looked nice, but the truth was that anything would have looked nice if it was going on Tom's finger. They had been so in love. There was also a small notebook, its pages wrinkled from the water but still mostly readable. Jack flipped through it carefully. It was Tom's handwriting, unmistakable with its slanted letters and heavy pressure, a journal he had kept during their time in Vietnam. Jack closed it quickly, not ready to read those words just yet. As the sun climbed higher, Jack realized he needed to make a decision. Linda would be worried by now. He had told her he'd be home by noon, and it was already past that. But he couldn't just stuff everything back into the box and leave. These weren't just things, they were pieces of his friend's life and his own. I should call someone, Jack said to himself, though he still had no cell service. Then a thought struck him. What if Tom's family was looking for these items? What if they had been stolen or lost? Maybe there had been a break-in, or a fire, or... His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a vehicle. Jack looked up to see a truck pulling into the small dirt parking area where he had left his own pickup. A park ranger stepped out, probably doing her usual rounds. Jack waved his arms and the ranger spotted him. She grabbed something from her truck and began walking toward him along the riverbank. As she got closer, Jack could see she was young, probably in her early 30s, with a serious expression that softened when she saw the concern on Jack's face. "Everything okay, sir?" she asked as she approached. Her name tag read, Ranger Chen. "I found something in the river," Jack said, gesturing to the wooden box and the items spread out around it. "I think it belongs to my friend's family, but I haven't seen them in years." Ranger Chen's eyes widened as she took in the scene. "You found all this in the river? In that box?" She crouched down to examine the makeshift coffin. "It was caught in the reeds downstream," Jack explained. "I pulled it out thinking..." He trailed off, not wanting to voice what he had feared. The ranger nodded, understanding without him having to say it. "These look pretty old," she said, carefully picking up one of the photos. "Any idea how they ended up in the river?" Jack shook his head. "No, but I know whose they are. At least I think I do. My friend Tom Wilson and his family. We served together in Vietnam. He didn't make it back." Jack's voice caught on the last words, even after all these years. Ranger Chen was quiet for a moment, respectful of his grief. Then she said, "I can help you get in touch with the local sheriff's office. They might be able to help locate the family." "Thank you," Jack said, grateful for her help. "But first I need to figure out what happened. The last I heard, Beth, that's Tom's wife, was living with their kids in Cedar Falls. That was years ago, though. We lost touch." Jack didn't explain why they had lost touch, how the guilt of surviving when Tom hadn't had eaten away at him until he couldn't bear to face Beth and the kids anymore, how he had moved 3 towns over with Linda to start fresh, telling himself it was better for everyone. "Well, let's start by getting all this somewhere safe and dry," Ranger Chen said practically. "My truck's just up the path. We can load everything in, and I can give you a ride back to your vehicle." Together, they carefully gathered the items, wrapping the more fragile ones in Jack's spare shirt from his tackle box. The ranger found an old blanket in her truck to line the wooden box, and they placed everything back inside as carefully as they could. As they worked, Jack told Ranger Chen about Tom, how they had grown up fishing this very river, how they had joined the army together right out of high school, how Tom had saved Jack's life the day before he died. "He pushed me into a ditch when the shooting started," Jack said quietly, as they carried the box up the path to the ranger's truck. "If he hadn't, I wouldn't be here. But he didn't have time to take cover himself." Ranger Chen listened without interrupting, seeming to understand that Jack needed to tell this story, maybe for the first time in decades. Once they had loaded everything, into her truck the ranger offered Jack her satellite phone. "You should probably call your wife. Let her know you're okay." Jack nodded gratefully and dialed home. Linda answered on the second ring, concern evident in her voice. "Jack? Where are you? I've been worried sick." "I'm okay, honey," he assured her. "Something came up at the river. I found something that belongs to Tom's family." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Linda knew all about Tom, about the nightmares that had plagued Jack for years after coming home. "Tom Wilson?" she finally asked. "Yes. It's their photos, Linda. Their memories, all packed up in a box and floating down the river like a burial at sea." Jack's voice broke again. Linda was quiet for a moment before saying, "Bring it home, Jack. We'll figure out what to do together." After thanking Ranger Chen and arranging to get his truck later, Jack sat in the passenger seat of the ranger's vehicle, the wooden box secure in the back. As they drove toward town, Jack's mind was filled with memories of Tom and Beth, of backyard barbecues and fishing trips, of the life they had planned to live as neighbors, raising their kids together. "Do you have any idea why their belongings would be in the river?" Ranger Chen asked, breaking into his thoughts. Jack shook his head, then remembered something. There was that big flood 5 years back. It hit Cedar Falls pretty hard. "You don't think—" The ranger nodded slowly. "Could be. A lot of homes were destroyed in that flood. People lost everything." Jack felt a chill despite the warm cab of the truck. Had Beth and the kids been caught in the flood? Were they even still alive? When they reached Jack's house, Linda was waiting on the porch. She hurried down the steps as the truck pulled into the driveway, her face lined with worry. Jack stepped out and embraced her, holding on perhaps a bit longer than usual. "I'm okay," he whispered, "just shaken up." Together with Ranger Chen, they carried the box into the house and set it on the kitchen table. Linda's eyes widened as Jack began to take out the items again, explaining each one to her. "Oh, Jack," she said softly, when he showed her the wedding photo of Tom and Beth. "They look so young." "We were all young then," Jack replied, the weight of the years suddenly heavy on his shoulders. Ranger Chen excused herself after giving Jack her card with a promise to check in the next day. "In the meantime, I'll ask around about the Wilson family. Someone in Cedar Falls might know what happened to them." After she left, Jack and Linda sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the fragments of the Wilsons' lives. Linda made coffee, and they went through each item together, with Jack explaining the significance of things she didn't recognize. "This was Tom's lucky fishing lure," Jack said, holding up a tarnished metal lure. "He swore it was the only one that worked in the deep part of Miller's Pond." He smiled at the memory, then his face grew serious again. "And this was the toy soldier I gave to his son Billy on his 5th birthday. He carried it everywhere." Linda reached across the table and took Jack's hand. "What are you going to do?" Jack looked at the items spread before them, the physical remnants of a friendship cut short, of a family he had once been close to. "I need to find them, Linda. I need to know what happened. And if they're gone, then I need to make sure these things are taken care of properly." "You've been carrying this guilt for too long, Jack," Linda said gently. "Tom wouldn't have wanted that." Jack nodded, knowing she was right, but unable to shake the feeling that had haunted him. For decades, finding this box feels like a sign, like Tom's reaching out, telling me it's time to make things right. Linda squeezed his hand. "Then we'll make it right. Together." That night, after carefully storing the items in their spare room, Jack lay awake long after Linda had fallen asleep. His mind was filled with questions. Why had the box been in the river? Was it an accident, or had someone put it there deliberately? And most importantly, where were Beth and the kids now? He thought about the flood 5 years ago that had devastated Cedar Falls. He remembered seeing it on the news, feeling a pang of worry for the Wilsons, but telling himself they had probably moved away years ago. Had he been wrong? Had they still been there fighting for their lives while he sat safe and dry in his living room? The guilt that had been his constant companion since Vietnam surged anew. But this time it came with a sense of purpose. Whatever had happened to the Wilson family, Jack would find out. He owed Tom that much. And maybe, just maybe in doing so, he could finally find some peace. As dawn broke, Jack had made up his mind. He would go to Cedar Falls, to the house where the Wilsons had lived. It was time to face the past he had been running from for far too long. The next morning, Jack woke early, his body stiff from a restless night. Linda was already in the kitchen making breakfast when he came downstairs. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, but Jack had little appetite. "I called the grandkids," Linda said, setting a plate in front of him. "Told them we'd have to reschedule dinner." Jack nodded gratefully. "I need to go to Cedar Falls today." "I know," Linda replied, sitting across from him. "And I'm coming with you." Jack looked up, surprised. Linda had never been to Cedar Falls, had never met Beth or the kids. She knew them only through Jack's stories. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted gently. "Whatever we find there, you shouldn't face it alone." Jack reached across the table and squeezed her hand, a lump forming in his throat. After 42 years of marriage, Linda still surprised him with her quiet strength. They left an hour later, the wooden box secured in the back seat of Jack's truck. Ranger Chen had called earlier to say she hadn't found any information yet but would keep looking. She also mentioned that the sheriff was interested in the case and might want to speak with Jack when he returned. The drive to Cedar Falls took just over 2 hours. As they crossed the county line, Jack felt his anxiety growing. It had been nearly 20 years since he'd been here, since he'd driven away telling himself it was for the best. The town had changed, new buildings had sprung up and old ones had disappeared. But there was still something familiar about the place that tugged at Jack's memories. The house was on Maple Street, he told Linda, as they drove through the center of town. A little white place with blue shutters and a big oak tree in the front yard. Linda nodded, watching the streets pass by. "Do you think they'll still be there? After all this time?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know. But it's the only place I know to start." They turned onto Maple Street, and Jack slowed the truck, scanning the houses. Many were clearly new construction, rebuilt after the flood. Others showed signs of repair, fresh paint, new roofs. The devastation had been extensive, but the town had recovered. Then Jack saw it, or rather, where it should have been. In place of the little white house with blue shutters was an empty lot. The big oak tree remained, but the house was gone, with only a concrete foundation to show where it had once stood. Jack pulled over and cut the engine, staring at the empty space. The box of memories in their back seat suddenly felt heavier. "Oh, Jack," Linda said softly, looking at the vacant lot. For a long moment they sat in silence. Then Jack opened his door. "I need to look around." They walked across the overgrown lot, stepping carefully over debris that still littered the ground 5 years after the flood. The concrete foundation was cracked in several places, with weeds pushing through. Nature was slowly reclaiming the space. "The living room was here," Jack said, pointing to one section of the foundation. "And the kitchen was back there. Tom built those cabinets himself. He was always good with his hands." As Jack walked around what remained of his friends' home, memories flooded back. Christmas dinners, summer barbecues, late nights sitting on the porch talking about everything and nothing. How had he walked away from all that? How had he let the guilt drive him away from the people who understood it best? "Can I help you folks?" Jack and Linda turned to see an elderly man watching them from the neighboring yard. He leaned on a cane, his face weathered but kind. "I'm sorry," Jack called back. "I used to know the family that lived here, the Wilsons." The old man's eyebrows rose in recognition. "Tom Wilson's place, yeah. You a friend of theirs?" Jack nodded, hope rising in his chest. "I am. I'm Jack Reynolds. Tom and I served together." The old man made his way over, each step careful and measured. "Frank Doyle," he said, extending his hand. "I've lived next door going on 30 years now." Jack shook his hand. This is my wife, Linda. We're trying to find Beth and the kids. Do you know what happened to them? Frank's face grew solemn. The flood took the house. Water came up so fast in the night nobody had time to grab much of anything. Beth and the kids got out, thank the Lord, but they lost pretty much everything. Relief washed over Jack. They were alive. Do you know where they went afterward? Beth's sister took them in for a while, Frank said. Lives over in Preston, about 20 miles east of here. Last I heard, Beth bought a little place there. Never came back to rebuild. Too many memories, I expect. Jack understood that all too well. Her sister, would that be Carol? Frank nodded. That's the one, nice lady. Comes by sometimes to check on the property. Beth still owns the lot, you know. Won't sell it, though plenty have offered. Jack turned to look at the empty foundation again. It made sense that Beth wouldn't sell. This had been their home, the place where she and Tom had built their life together. There was a wooden box, Jack said, turning back to Frank. About this big. He held his hands apart to show the size. Would have had family photos, letters, that sort of thing. Did Beth ever mention anything like that going missing in the flood? Frank thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Come, to think of it, she did say something about losing a cedar chest Tom had made. She was real broken up about it. Said it had all their important papers and photos in it. He looked at Jack curiously. Why do you ask? I found it, Jack said, his voice thick. Yesterday, caught in the reeds downstream. That's why we're here. I'm trying to return it to her. Frank's eyes widened. No kidding? After all this time? He shook his head in wonder. River gives up its treasures when it's good and ready, I guess. Do you have Carol's address? Linda asked. Or a phone number? Frank didn't have the address, but he knew Carol's last name was Harris. It was enough to go on. They thanked him for his help and were about to leave when Frank called after them. When you see Beth, tell her Frank's still keeping an eye on the place, he said, and tell her that Oak Tree's still standing strong, just like Tom would have wanted. Jack promised he would, his throat tight with emotion. Back in the truck, they stopped at a local diner to use a phone book. There were 3 C. Harrises listed in Preston, but only one on Elm Street, which Frank had mentioned in passing. The drive to Preston was quiet, both Jack and Linda lost in their thoughts. Jack kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the wooden box, hardly able to believe that after floating down miles of river, it had somehow found its way to him. Was it coincidence or something more? Jack had never been a particularly religious man, but there were times when the universe seemed to work in mysterious ways. Preston was smaller than Cedar Falls, a quiet town with a single main street lined with shops and a town square with a gazebo at its center. They found Elm Street easily enough and drove slowly, looking for house numbers. That must be it, Linda said, pointing to a modest blue house with a well-tended garden. A mailbox by the curb confirmed it. Harris. Jack parked across the street, suddenly nervous. What would he say to Beth after all these years? How would he explain his absence, his silence? Would she even want to see him? It'll be okay, Linda said, reading his thoughts as she often did. You're returning something precious to her. That's what matters now. They approached the house together, Jack carrying the wooden box. He took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. For a moment there was no response, and Jack wondered if no one was home. Then the door opened and a woman in her 60s stood before them. It wasn't Beth. Can I help you? The woman asked, looking curiously at Jack, Linda, and the box. I'm looking for Beth Wilson, Jack said. Or Carol Harris. This is the Harris residence, isn't it? The woman nodded. I'm Carol. Beth is my sister. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Do I know you? Jack shifted the box in his arms. I'm Jack Reynolds. I was a friend of Tom's. This belongs to your sister. Carol's eyes widened as she looked at the box, recognition dawning on her face. That's Tom's cedar chest, the one Beth lost in the flood. She looked back at Jack, really seeing him now. Jack, yes, I remember you. From the funeral. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Carol opened the door wider. You'd better come in. Beth isn't here right now, but she should be home soon. She just went to pick up my grandson from baseball practice. They followed Carol into a cozy living room. Photos lined the walls and shelves, many showing Beth with two grown children who must be Billy and Lily, Tom's kids. Jack felt a pang at how much they'd grown, how much he had missed. "Where did you find it?" Carol asked as Jack set the box on the coffee table. "In the river, caught in some reeds," Jack explained. "I was fishing, and there it was." Carol shook her head in amazement. Beth looked everywhere for this after the flood. It was the one thing she wanted to find more than anything. She ran her hand over the water-damaged wood. "Tom made this chest for their first anniversary. Said every family needs a place to keep their important things." Jack smiled sadly. "That sounds like Tom." "Beth should be back any minute," Carol said, glancing at the clock. "Would you like some coffee while you wait?" As Carol went to the kitchen, Jack looked around the room, taking in the evidence of a life continued. There were recent photos of what must be grandchildren, vacation snapshots, school portraits. Life had gone on for the Wilsons, even without Tom, even after the flood. And then Jack heard a car in the driveway, doors opening and closing, voices approaching the house. He stood, his heart pounding as the front door opened. "Carol, we're back," called a familiar voice. "Jimmy hit a double today, you should have seen." Beth Wilson stopped in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Jack. She looked older, of course, her dark hair now streaked with gray, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, but it was unmistakably her. And beside her stood a boy of about 12 who looked so much like Tom that Jack's breath caught in his throat. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Beth's eyes fell on the wooden box on the coffee table and her hand went to her mouth. "Jack," she whispered. Is that Tom's chest?" Jack could only nod. His voice caught somewhere in his throat. After 20 years of avoiding this moment, he suddenly found himself without words. Beth moved slowly into the room, her eyes never leaving the wooden chest. The boy, Jimmy, she had called him, looked between the adults with confusion. "Grandma, who is this?" he asked. Beth put a hand on his shoulder. "This is Mr. Reynolds," she said softly. "He was your grandpa's best friend." Jimmy's eyes widened with interest. "The one from the Army stories." Beth nodded, then turned to Carol. "Could you take Jimmy to the kitchen for a snack?" Carol understood immediately. She put an arm around the boy's shoulders. "Come on, kiddo. Let's give the grown-ups a minute." She nodded to Jack as she passed, a silent thank you in her eyes. When they were gone, Beth finally looked directly at Jack. There was no anger in her face, which somehow made Jack feel worse. Anger he could have understood, could have weathered. This quiet acceptance was harder to bear. "After all these years," she said, moving closer to the cedar chest. "Where did you find it?" Jack cleared his throat. "In the river. I was fishing yesterday, and it was caught in some reeds." He paused. "I didn't know it was yours at first, not until I opened it and saw the photos." Beth knelt beside the coffee table, running her fingers over the water-damaged wood much as her sister had done. "Tom made this the first year we were married, said every family memory needed a safe place." She looked up at Jack. "When the flood came, we barely got out with the clothes on our backs. This was the one thing I wished I could have saved." Jack introduced Linda, who had been standing quietly nearby. Beth greeted her warmly, then invited them both to sit. "I'm sorry I never reached out," Jack said, the words tumbling out after being held back for so long. "After Tom died, I couldn't." Beth raised a hand to stop him. "You don't have to explain, Jack. I understood. We all deal with grief in our own way." But Jack shook his head. "No, I need to say this. I should have been there for you. And the kids. Tom would have wanted that. But every time I looked at Billy and Lily, all I could think was that their father should be standing there instead of me." Beth's eyes softened. "Tom saved your life. He wouldn't have had it any other way, and he certainly wouldn't have wanted you to spend your life feeling guilty for surviving." Jack had heard these words before, from Linda, from his therapist years ago, but somehow hearing them from Beth made them sink in differently. "Is everything still in there?" Beth asked, looking at the chest. "As far as I can tell," Jack replied. "The water damaged some things, but most of it is intact. Tom's journal, the photos, his medals." Beth's breath caught. His medals? Those were in there? Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought they were gone forever." Jack nodded. "They're a bit tarnished, but they're there." With trembling hands, Beth opened the chest. The items had been carefully dried and arranged by Jack and Linda, and Beth gasped as she saw the familiar treasures. "Oh my God," she whispered, lifting out a photo of Tom in his uniform. "I don't have any other copies of this." She looked up at Jack, tears streaming down her face now. "You have no idea what this means to me, to the kids." Jack swallowed hard. "Frank, your old neighbor, told us about the flood. He said to tell you he's still keeping an eye on the place and that the oak tree is still standing strong." Beth smiled through her tears. "That sounds like Frank. He's been a good friend." She paused, then asked, "How much did he tell you?" "Just that you lost the house in the flood and moved in with Carol for a while," Linda answered. Beth nodded, her fingers still tracing the edges of the photo. "It was more than that. The flood came in the middle of the night. The water rose so fast. We had to climb out through a bedroom window. Billy, my son, went back for the chest. He knew how much it meant to me." Her voice broke. The water was already up to his chest by then. He almost didn't make it out. Jack felt his stomach clench at the thought of how close they had come to tragedy. "After that, Billy couldn't stand to be near the river anymore. That's why we moved inland." Beth sighed. "We thought the chest was swept away with half our belongings. I never imagined it would turn up after all this time." The front door opened again, and a man in his 30s walked in. He stopped short when he saw the strangers in the living room. Then his eyes fell on the chest. "Mom?" he said uncertainly. "Billy," Beth said, standing up. "You remember Jack Reynolds? Your father's friend from the service?" Billy stared at Jack for a long moment, recognition slowly dawning on his face. He had been just a boy when Jack had last seen him, but now he was a grown man with Tom's height and build. "Uncle Jack?" he said, using the name he had called him as a child. Jack nodded, his chest tight. "It's been a long time." Billy crossed the room in 3 long strides and, to Jack's surprise, pulled him into a hug. "Too long," he said, his voice thick with emotion. When they separated, Billy looked down at the chest. "Is that—" "Jack found it in the river," Beth explained. "Everything's still inside." Billy's face showed his disbelief. "That's impossible. That river carried away houses, cars. How could this survive?" Jack had been wondering the same thing. It must have gotten caught somewhere all these years, protected somehow. The recent heavy rains probably dislodged it and sent it downstream. Or maybe someone was looking out for us, Beth said softly, her eyes on Tom's photo. They spent the next hour going through the contents of the chest together. Billy called his sister Lily, who lived just a few blocks away, and she rushed over with her husband and young daughter. The small living room was soon crowded with people, all marveling over the recovered treasures. Jack watched as 3 generations of Wilsons pored over photos and letters, passing them around, sharing stories. Jimmy and his cousin were especially fascinated by Tom's military medals, listening wide-eyed as Jack and Billy told them stories about their grandfather's bravery. "He saved my life," Jack told the children, "not just in the war, but every day after. Knowing him made me a better person." As the afternoon wore on, the initial shock gave way to a feeling of celebration. Carol brought out sandwiches and drinks. Lily's husband ran home to get their family photo albums, so they could show Jack and Linda how the family had grown over the years. Jack was amazed to learn that Billy had followed in his father's footsteps, serving 4 years in the Army, before coming home to work as a firefighter. Lily had become a teacher, just as she had always wanted to be when she was little. Both had married, had children of their own. Tom would be so proud of them, Beth said quietly to Jack as they watched the family interact. Sometimes I see so much of him in them that it takes my breath away. I should have been here, Jack said. I missed so much. Beth took his hand. You're here now. That's what matters. As evening approached, Linda suggested they should head back home, but Beth wouldn't hear of it. You'll stay for dinner, she insisted. All of us together. Tom would have wanted that. They moved the gathering to Carol's large dining room table. Folding chairs were brought in, extra plates found. It was chaotic and loud and wonderful, exactly the kind of family dinner Jack had avoided for so many years, afraid of the emotions it would stir up. During a lull in the conversation, Billy tapped his glass with a fork. When everyone quieted down, he raised his glass. To Dad, he said, who's probably looking down right now, laughing at how his old cedar chest managed to bring us all back together. To Tom, everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Beth turned to Jack. And to Jack, who never gave up fishing in that same spot, all these years. If you had, we might never have gotten these memories back. Jack felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him, felt the tears threatening again. To old friends, he said, and to new beginnings. Later, as they prepared to leave, Beth walked Jack and Linda to their truck. The wooden chest remained in her living room where she said it would stay from now on. Promise me something, Beth said, taking both of Jack's hands in hers. Promise you won't be a stranger anymore. Life's too short and family is too precious. Family. The word caught Jack by surprise, but he realized it was true. The Wilsons were his family, had always been his family. He had just been too caught up in his guilt to see it. I promise, he said, and for the first time in decades he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. As they drove home through the darkening evening, Linda reached over and took his hand. How do you feel? She asked. Jack thought about the question for a long moment. Like I've been carrying something heavy for a very long time and I've finally put it down. Linda smiled. Good. It's strange, Jack said, watching the countryside roll by. All these years I thought I was honoring Tom's memory by feeling guilty for surviving, but that's not what he would have wanted at all. No, Linda agreed. He would have wanted you to live, to be there for his family, to find joy. Jack nodded, thinking of the wooden chest that had traveled so far to find him. Had it been coincidence that brought it to that exact spot on the river on that exact day? Or was it something else, a message from an old friend perhaps, telling him it was finally time to let go? Whatever the answer, Jack knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow he would call Beth. They would make plans to get together again soon. And maybe, just maybe, he would take Jimmy fishing, not in the river, but in the small lake on the other side of town, where he and Tom had caught their first fish as boys. It was time to create new memories while honoring the old ones that had been so miraculously returned to them. 6 months had passed since Jack pulled the cedar chest from the river. The seasons had changed, summer giving way to fall, then winter, and now the first hints of spring were appearing along the river banks. The world had continued turning as it always did, but for Jack, everything was different. He stood on the bank of Miller's Pond, watching as Jimmy cast his line into the still water. The boy had a natural talent, his movements smooth and confident, despite having only taken up fishing a few months ago. Just like that, Jack encouraged. Let it settle for a moment before you start reeling in. Jimmy nodded, his face a picture of concentration. At 12 years old, he had his grandfather's serious approach to fishing, methodical, patient, observant. It was like seeing Tom all over again, and the resemblance sometimes took Jack's breath away. Grandpa Beth says you and Grandpa Tom used to catch huge bass in this pond, Jimmy said, his eyes never leaving the spot where his line disappeared into the water. We did, Jack confirmed with a smile. Though I suspect our stories got bigger with each telling. Jimmy grinned. That's what Mom says too. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that comes naturally between people who understand that fishing is as much about the quiet moments as it is about the catch. A blue heron stalked through the shallows nearby, undisturbed by their presence. So much had changed since that day Jack found the chest. True to his word, he had stayed in touch with the Wilsons. What started as weekly phone calls soon became regular visits. Jack and Linda had spent Thanksgiving with Beth and her family, and the Wilsons had joined them for Christmas. It was as if the 20-year gap had been bridged, not erased. They acknowledged it had happened, but they no longer let it define their relationship. Jack had been surprised at how easily he fit back into their lives, and how willingly they welcomed him. There was no resentment, no awkwardness, just the warm embrace of people who understood loss and the value of second chances. Jimmy's line suddenly went taut, pulling him forward a step. "I got something," he shouted, all pretense of calm forgotten as he began reeling in his catch. Jack moved to his side, ready to help but letting the boy do the work. "Easy now. Don't rush it," he advised. "Tire it out first." Jimmy fought the fish for nearly 5 minutes, his young face flushed with effort and excitement. When he finally pulled it from the water, it was a respectable largemouth bass glistening in the morning sun. "Would you look at that?" Jack said proudly as he helped Jimmy unhook the fish. "That's a good 4-pounder at least." Jimmy beamed. "Can we show Grandpa Beth before we let it go?" Jack nodded. "She's probably got lunch ready by now anyway. Let's put him in the bucket with some water." They gathered their gear and walked back toward the cabin that Jack had rented for the weekend. It sat at the edge of the pond, a simple 2-bedroom place, with a screened porch overlooking the water. Beth was there now, setting out sandwiches on the picnic table. "Grandpa Beth," Jimmy called out as they approached. "Look what I caught." Beth turned, her face lighting up at the sight of them. "My goodness, that's a beauty," she exclaimed, coming down the steps to admire the fish. "Your grandpa Tom would be so proud." Jimmy puffed up at the praise. After they'd taken a photo with the fish, Jack helped him release it back into the pond. They watched as it swam away, disappearing into the depths. "Did you know," Jack said as they washed up for lunch, "that this is the exact spot where your grandpa Tom caught his first base? We were about your age, maybe a little younger." Jimmy's eyes widened. "Really? Right here?" Jack nodded. "We rode our bikes all the way from town with our fishing poles tied to the handlebars. Took us nearly an hour to get here. Your grandpa was so excited when he felt that first tug on his line that he almost fell in the water." Beth laughed. "I've never heard that story." "There are a lot of stories I haven't told yet," Jack admitted. "But we've got time for them now." After lunch, Billy and Lily arrived with their families. What had started as a simple fishing trip with Jimmy had turned into an impromptu family gathering. Linda came with them, bringing the pie she had promised to bake. The small cabin was soon filled with laughter and conversation. As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself sitting on the porch with Beth, watching the younger generations play a makeshift game of baseball in the clearing by the pond. "Tom would have loved this," Beth said softly. "All of us together." Jack nodded. He was always happiest when he was surrounded by family. "Which is why I wanted to talk to you about something," Beth said, turning to face him. "I've been thinking about the old property in Cedar Falls." Jack raised his eyebrows. In all the months since he'd returned the chest, Beth had never mentioned any plans for the empty lot where her house had once stood. "Frank called last week," she continued. "Said the town is finally finishing up their flood control project. They're saying it's safe to rebuild now." "Are you thinking of moving back?" Jack asked, surprised. He had gotten the impression that Beth was settled and happy in Preston with her family nearby. Beth shook her head. "No, but I don't want to sell it either. That land meant too much to Tom." She paused. "I was thinking of turning it into a small memorial park. Nothing fancy, just a place with some benches and maybe a playground for kids. Somewhere peaceful where people could go to sit by the river." Jack smiled at the idea. Tom would have liked that. "The thing is," Beth went on, "I could use some help with it. Someone who knew Tom as well as I did, who could help make decisions about what he would have wanted." She looked at Jack meaningfully. "Someone who might enjoy having a project to work on now that he's retired?" Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest. The idea of helping create something lasting in Tom's memory, of having a purpose that connected him to his friend and to the river that had brought them back together. It felt right. "I'd be honored," he said. Beth smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." Later, as the sun began to set over the pond, casting long golden reflections across the water, the family gathered around a small fire pit near the shore. Billy had brought his guitar, and he played quietly while the younger children roasted marshmallows. Jack sat with Linda on one side and Beth on the other, listening as Billy played a song that Tom had loved. It was a simple tune about rivers and time and coming home again. Jack felt the familiar ache of missing his friend, but it was different now. Softer, gentler, mixed with gratitude for all that remained. Jimmy came to sit at Jack's feet, leaning against his knee as he stared into the fire. "Uncle Billy says you're going to help build a park where Grandpa Tom's house used to be," he said. "That's right," Jack replied. "Would you like to help too? We could use a strong back and some good ideas." Jimmy nodded eagerly. "I could build a fishing dock like the one we use here." "That's a fine idea," Jack said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Your grandpa would have approved." As the evening deepened and stars began to appear overhead, Jack found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment, how close he had come to missing it all, this second chance, this extended family, this peace. If he hadn't been at the river that day, if the chest hadn't broken free from wherever it had been trapped all those years, if he hadn't recognized Tom's photos, but it had happened, exactly as it needed to. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was something more. Jack wasn't sure he needed to know the answer anymore. A month later, Jack stood at the edge of the empty lot in Cedar Falls, plans spread out on the hood of his truck. The spring sun was warm on his shoulders as he showed the contractor where they wanted to put the playground, the picnic area, the fishing dock that Jimmy had insisted on. The old oak tree still stood tall at the edge of the property, its new leaves catching the light. Jack had insisted they build around it, not just because it was beautiful, but because it had survived the flood just as they all had. A small crowd had gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony. Beth and her family, some neighbors, a few town officials. Frank was there too, leaning on his cane but beaming with pride as the mayor talked about community resilience and new beginnings. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he kept it simple. Tom Wilson loved this town, this river, and most of all, his family, he said. This park is a way to honor all three, a place where new memories can be made, where stories can be shared, where life goes on. He looked at Beth, at Billy and Lily, at Jimmy and the other grandchildren. Tom lives on in all of you, and now he'll live on in this place too. As Jack pushed the ceremonial shovel into the earth, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The wooden chest that had traveled so far to find him had carried more than just photos and mementos. It had carried a message, a reminder that some things can never be lost. Not friendship, not family, not love. The river had taken much from them all those years ago, but in its own time, in its own way, the river had given back. Not everything, never everything, but enough. Enough to remind them that even in loss, there is the possibility of finding something precious. And as Jack looked out over the river flowing peacefully beyond the property, he could almost hear Tom's laugh on the breeze, could almost see him, standing there with that crooked smile, saying, "What took you so long, old friend? I've been waiting for you." Jack smiled and whispered, "I'm here now, better late than never." And in the gentle rustle of the oak tree's leaves, in the timeless flow of the river, in the circle of family surrounding him, Jack knew that Tom had heard him.